Today we're looking at a remarkable game in which Magnus Carlsen plays a very weird and unusual opening. And I don't mean unusual like 1 out of 100 or 1 out of 1,000. I mean like only 1 out of 500,000 games played online actually ever reached the position that Carlsen had after only his second move in this recently played blitz game on chess.com with a young upcoming 13-year-old prodigy and FIDE master by the name of Vaclav Finek. Carlsen, with the white pieces, decided to begin the game with the move a4, a move which accomplishes very little, taking no central control and really only facilitating the development of his rook, although this is not typically a good idea so early in the game and is actually something amateurs tend to get themselves into trouble doing. Finek replies sensibly, staking his claim in the center with the move e5. And now, as if a4 wasn't disrespectful enough, Magnus trolls his opponent even further with the move a5, basically giving Finek another free move with the black pieces without much of anything to show for it besides this rogue a-pawn, which looks like it's on some kind of a suicide mission. So what is Carlsen thinking here? Has he lost his mind? Is he having a stroke? No, I think he's just bored. He wins almost every game he plays, and he wants to let this young whippersnapper start with a little edge, get him out of book, make things interesting. And they do get interesting. Finek plays bishop to c5, which looks reasonable, but d5 or knight f6 is actually better. This move commits the bishop a little prematurely to a square where it can be kicked around by a pawn thrust to the center by Carlsen, which he prepares for immediately with the move e3. He's going to play d4 with tempo on the bishop, and it can't really be stopped. If Finek were to try with the move knight c6, then Carlsen could just play knight to f3, which supports d4 further, and if e4 is played, d4 can be played anyway. It's still a fine move. The bishop's attacked. So, Finek doesn't do that. He plays sensibly, placing a pawn in the center. Now we got d4 attacking the bishop on c5. A couple pawns get traded, and then the bishop drops back to d6. And here it becomes clear that Finek has not really made the most of Carlsen's two wasted moves at the beginning of the game. The pawn structure is rather symmetrical, and black is leading in development by only one move. By having that bishop on d6, Carlsen has pretty much succeeded in equalizing the position. And now he continues with c4, challenging the central pawn. Knight to f6 defends, knight to c3 adds more pressure, and Finek plays a good move. He castles. And now Carlsen opts out of trying to win a pawn on d5. If you were to play that move, then bishop to b4 would pin the only defender of d5. It's hit by 2 pieces. White's not going to be able to hang on to that pawn, and this is very risky when your king is in the center. So Carlsen very prudently instead plays knight to f3. Finek plays rook to e8 check. And now Carlsen does not play the best move, which is bishop to e2. Maybe he didn't like d takes c4. And you can't recapture the pawn because the bishop's pinned to the king, of course, by the rook. But if Carlsen were to castle, then the c-pawn is ready to be rounded up. Black doesn't really have a good way to hang on to that weak pawn. So this would have been Carlsen's best line of play. But maybe he's still trolling his opponent. I don't know. He plays bishop to e3, which allows knight to g4. After which Carlsen has no good way to avoid the exchange of his bishop for Finek's knight. Queen to d2 defends. Finek takes a moment to defend his pawn on c6. And after bishop to e2, the knight captures on e3. Carlsen, of course, has to recapture with the pawn, and here black has a slight advantage due to white's backward e-pawn and the fact that he does have the bishop pair. But he has a huge disadvantage due to the fact that he's playing Magnus Carlsen, who will undoubtedly find a way to turn this game in white's favor very soon. Bishop e6 is a good move, developing a piece, more pressure on c4, so Carlsen trades off that pawn. C takes d5, c takes d5, and now castles. And here Finek begins to go wrong. He plays this very natural looking move, knight to c6. But the best move actually would have been a6. You want to fix this pawn on a5, after which you'll be able to target it with knight to c6 with help from the queen. But after what was played in the game, knight to c6, Carlsen is free to push this pawn to a6, hitting the b pawn. Now if this pawn gets traded off, he's going to have a nice open file for his rook. Finek doesn't want that, so he plays b6. But this situation is a little bit different than having the pawn stranded on a5 where it could be targeted. In this situation, the pawn's well defended by the bishop and the rook and is getting ominously close to the queening square where it has the potential to become dangerous in the endgame For example, if white someday were to sacrifice a piece on b6 here, after the pawn recaptures, then there are no pawns impeding this pawn's progress towards becoming a queen. This move b6 also took protection off the knight on c6, so that Carlsen's next move, bishop to b5, does come with tempo, attacking the knight, which is pinned to the rook. And at this point, Carlsen has equalized the position. Rook to c8 from Finek, protecting the knight, and now rook a to c1, placing the rook on an open file and setting up the potential for a discovered attack on this knight on c6 when this knight here moves, although this is not too much of a threat yet because this knight doesn't have anywhere very harmful to move to. But Finek does want to be able to move this knight since it is pinned to his rook, which is why he chooses to move this rook, which is a good idea, but he moves it to the wrong square. He plays rook to e7. Playing the rook to f8 would have actually been better here. e7 looks sensible. He wants to double his rooks on the c-file. The only problem with having the rook on e7 is it blocks the queen's access to g5, after which Carlsen is able to jump to that square with his knight, attacking the bishop on e6, which cannot move because it's defending the d5 pawn. We don't want the knight to take that, so Finek is going to lose his bishop pair. Whether or not he just missed this move, I don't know. Maybe he thought it was worth it to be able to double his rooks, which is what he does on his next move. But after knight takes e6, f takes e6, Magnus Carlsen actually has a pretty sizable advantage here. After the move queen to f2, moving toward the king side, that's where he's going to attack. Notice all black's pieces are congregated over here on the queen side, banking on this double rook battery, but it's not really going to amount to much. Finek plays queen to e7. This prepares the possibility for a rook to move back to f8 with tempo on the white queen. But a better move actually would have been queen to g5, which is a little more active, and it would defend the d5 pawn, which is targeted after Carlsen's next move, queen to f3. This sets up a threat. If it were white's turn to move again, there would be knight takes d5, e takes d5, and after exchanging some pieces on c6, white is going to come out ahead in material due to the fact that there's this queen takes d5 check here, picking up the rook. Carlsen is just so good at immediately jumping on these tactical ideas, even in these blitz games. Now, Finek, being a strong young prodigy, does not miss this threat and vacates the c6 square with the move knight to d8. Carlsen plays rook c to e1, and he's preparing his next move after Finek plays knight to f7, e4, threatening to win a pawn by taking on d5, which Finek deals with by playing the move knight to g5. With tempo on the queen, hitting the pawn, okay, queen goes to g4, and the best chance for black here would be to take on e4 with the knight, and after knight takes, d takes, rook takes e4, e6 is a big weakness. It's targeted by the queen and the rook, but black can get a little counterplay with the move rook to c1. This is his best chance. White still might be winning here, but what was played in the game was d takes e4. Big mistake. And how do you think Carlsen responded? What would you play here as white? Take a moment, look at the position, and see if you can spot white's strongest move here. Carlsen does not immediately capture the pawn on e4. Instead, he plays h4, forcing this knight to retreat to f7 and then taking with the knight, after which there will be no knight takes e4, which is good for Carlsen because he has a very serious threat here involving this knight. What do you think it is? Here's a clue. It involves pinned pawns. White is threatening to play knight to f6 check. This pawn on g7 being pinned to the king may not capture the knight. And of course you don't want to capture it with the queen for obvious reasons, so the king must move. But now, knight to d5, taking advantage of another pinned pawn. And this is unfortunately a fork. So how does Finek deal with this threat? Well, sadly, he doesn't. He plays e5. And since this does nothing to address the threat, Magnus Carlsen could easily win with knight to f6 check, followed by knight to d5. But he plays an equally crushing move instead, bishop to d7, hitting the rook. And Finek at this point knows what's coming. He plays rook to f8. He's realizing that this knight is going to need more protection, because what's coming next is bishop to e6. The knight is pinned to the king, and you might think it's okay, it's defended by 3 pieces, but one of those defenders is the queen, which is also defending the bishop on d6, which is a bit of a problem. She's got double duty, so Finek wants to get that bishop out of view of this knight on e4, and he plays it to b4, attacking the rook. And here, Carlsen finds a very beautiful sequence. He plays rook takes f7. After rook takes f7, this rook is free to play to f1, attacking the rook which is pinned to the king. It's got 3 defenders, but one of those defenders is the queen, which will be lost if there's an exchange on f7 at this point. So Finek needs to move this queen so that this rook can be first to recapture if the rook on f7 is taken. So where to move this queen? Well, at this point, Finek probably realized that it's completely hopeless. If he were to move this queen somewhere where she's still defending the rook, like let's say queen to f8, after knight to g5, Black would have the choice between losing a whole rook or giving up his queen. So in a desperate bid for some counterplay, Finek decides to play queen to d8. You know, maybe he was thinking Carlsen would play knight to g5 and he'd go queen takes d4 check. But Carlsen didn't even go for knight to g5. He's got a lot of crushing options, and he opted for just taking on f7 with the rook. After rook takes f7, queen to f5, hitting that rook, which is still pinned to the king with 2 pieces. Queen to e7 defends, and here comes the 3rd piece, knight to g5. Black has no more pieces to add to the defense of this rook, and it will be lost. Finek tries g6, desperately attacking Carlsen's queen, and how many of us would just grab the rook? But Carlsen knows that rook's not going anywhere, and he decides to grab a pawn first on e5, giving Finek the chance to unpin his rook with king to f8, maybe hoping by some miracle that Carlsen doesn't capture it on his next move with knight takes f7 and then he can move it out of danger. A fantasy which partly came true, that is, Carlsen did not take the rook on f7, because when you have mate in 1, who needs a free rook, right? And so ended this fascinating encounter between the great Magnus Carlsen and this young prodigy on chess.com. So I hope you enjoyed this. Please subscribe to the channel for more content like this coming soon, with hopefully many more encounters to come between Magnus Carlsen and Vaclav Finek.